Resolute Square.
There was also maintained what was called an enemies list, which is rather extensive and continually being updated.
Democrats want Republicans dead.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
No, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
I'm Rick Wilson, and this is The Enemies List.
Welcome back to The Enemies List. My second guest today is Matt Dixon. Matt is the senior national political reporter with NBC. He covers a whole wide spectrum of the chaotic Republican presidential race and frankly, stories beyond that that's going on this year. But Matt is a fellow Florida man, and we have a mutual interest in the anthropology, the psychology, the performance of one Ron DeSantis, who has been having some low light campaign that was marked for about a year of pretty easygoing highlights. Matt, welcome back to you've been on here before, right? Did we have you before?
I think so. It's been a little
while.
while.
I've had you on some podcast or another before. Anyway, well, Matt, welcome to the.
Thank you. I'm honorable, Florida man. I wasn't born here, but I've been here 15 years, and the state just sort of seeps into your DNA somehow. So now I feel Florida man.
Well, look. After 15 years, you're a Florida man. I mean, I'm a fifth generation Florida man, so I'm a different animal. But you are certainly you've earned your Florida stripes after 15 years. You've had your share of pub subs, as they say. So listen, Matt, I want to talk to you a little bit. You were out covering the Ron DeSantis campaign event this weekend in Park City, Utah, a town I've spent some time in. What's the feeling inside DeSantis world after week after week of off the rails chaos, dissent, concern stories percolating out of his world?
I don't think the disconnect between sort of public perception of the DeSantis campaign and how the money folks and the inside folks feel could be any larger. There was a real, despite 2 months that really haven't gone well. It's been a campaign launch that's kind of gone off the rails relatively quickly. He's actually, trailing more in the polls to President Trump now. The team huddled and I don't think they were blowing real smoke. Sure. I think there's a legit sense of optimism still that they can, we've all talked about, and you've tweeted endlessly about the proverbial quote reset. And there remains optimism within his camp and especially with the donors that were out in Park City this weekend that what they plan on trying to do is actually going to work and sort of get things back on track, even as Donald Trump continues to have 30, 40 point leads and seemingly sort of his narcotic like effect on the Republican base isn't really going anywhere.
I mean, it's not a secret in Tallahassee that Ron DeSantis is not a guy who's really particularly warm and personable. He's not one of these people with that sort of candidate charisma where you walk out of the room and think, man, I'm going to be friends with this guy. Are the donors? I mean, and I've talked to a couple of people who have cooled on him, and the sense is sort of like, we were really looking for anybody except Trump, and it looks so good in Florida on paper, and why can't he connect with people, and why can't he be somebody that has a sort of warmer affect? And I've told all of them, like, that's not this guy. He's not ever going to be, he's not ever going to be the guy who emotionally connects with people.
Right. And I've had it described to me, because you're right, like the general idea of him connecting. Even I've had stories of, even in his day job, meeting with, influential business groups or the folks that usually carry the currency of the day in Tallahassee and state capitals across the country. And even in those meetings, he's kind of in the corner on his phone as staff leads the meeting. There's no connection politically, personally, professionally. But I have heard him described to me, and going back to a setting like Park City, as kind of a quote billionaire whisperer. And we saw this a little bit with Sheldon Adelson. Sheldon Adelson, the late Sheldon Adelson, chaired his finance committee in 2018 when he ran for governor. That's a guy who doesn't really get involved with state level politics, or didn't get involved with state level politics. And there's an anecdote that I've gotten into a little bit in the past where he went over and met with him and it went really well. And his staff at that point said, he's just, if you're a quote run of the mill millionaire, he might not, give you the the time of day. He doesn't necessarily respect that, but with a group of people like that, it's kind of a different switch for him in his brain. And I think there was probably some of that with the donors who are sticking with him, even though things aren't going well. Well, no doubt there's a few that have even publicly said that they're, either shopping for other candidates or no longer with him. That's very much a reality. But I do think he's going to be able to keep enough people on board to fund this thing for a while, no matter how it looks in public polling.
Right. I do think, though, that I think there have been a number of his major donors who are now publicly and privately sort of, the Schwartzmans of the world, sort of flirting with Glenn Youngkin, trying to get him in the race. And I think the DeSantis campaign always was in a weird wedge because, for the billionaire class, they have to have one message. But for the rest of the Republican base, tell us a little bit about how they sort of tried to meme their way into this very online image for DeSantis, and how do you think that's going for him? Both in the primary, when you're posting up against Trump, and how do you think it would play out as you get to a general election, since he's parked himself out pretty far out on the cliff on a lot of these issues?
Oh, you're playing the role of attorney here. You're asking questions you know the answer to, Rick. The general idea of allowing the sort of online trolls not just in the room, but to sort of control the room hasn't just been a strategy. Right. It's been the strategy. Reporters in Florida, national reporters are starting to learn the reality that we've been stuck with here in Florida for 3 or 4 years, where, your texts and emails are fair game to be screenshot and put online. There'll be personal attacks, and the media strategy is to attack the media. Mm-hmm. There's an open acknowledgement that making our life more difficult is sort of the goal and the strategy. And that, that has worked well for him as governor. He won by 20 points. He, turned Miami-Dade blue. It's a strategy. Well, that's only part of the story because Democrats kind of give up on the state. But if we're talking about DeSantis, what he has done, a 20-point victory can't be understated. It worked for him as governor. As it turns out, a broader audience, when he leaves sort of the safety of the Florida ecosystem, it hasn't exactly gone as well. Some of the same tactics that helped him rise post-pandemic are making, people aren't receptive to them. It looks kind of strange when the light gets a lot brighter. And I think they're learning that now. They do have more traditional communications folks on the super PAC side. There are some people who have interacted with the press in a much more traditional way, and it hasn't been nearly as adversarial. So I think they're starting to realize that. I think some of the people that have become sort of celebrities in the far right Twitter sphere have been their X sphere, I guess, that the X's sphere, or right, whatever we're supposed to call it now, have sort of been sidelined, and they're not nearly quite as influential because the messaging. I guess as I say that, I'm reminded of the ad that just went viral that they apparently produced in-house and sent out. So I'm kind of stepping on my own point here, but I do think more broadly the communication strategy is getting slightly more traditional, and we're going to see more of that moving forward. Whether it's too late or not, I really don't know, but I do think there is a bit of a shift, and even reporters who cover him a lot have noticed that as more traditional communications people come in the fold.
It is interesting that the Hochmans and Pushaws of the world, who had a very dominant role in the beginning of this. I think those two videos that were put out they were end up being created in-house, but released by the campaign, pretending they weren't being created in-house. I think they probably lost an awful lot of currency with the most important constituency of all, which is Casey, who was obviously, she may be a pretty far right individual, but she was also embarrassed by those things. Those things were embarrassing to the campaign, and they don't seem like they have a lot of tolerance for embarrassment.
Right. And I think those things can be reflected in just the tweets that we've seen, not only from the individuals, but the new DeSantis War Room Twitter account, which I think a lot of the folks we're talking about kind of controlled. The messaging and the sort of pugilistic nature of that account has been toned down quite a bit. So I think there are overt signals, or that aren't very subtle, that some of those folks are the influence is waning,
right,
I guess.
And that clack of influencers on Twitter that they had sort of assembled to be the DeSantis cheering section. When he went on CNN the other day, there was a sort of obvious, you could hear the gears in their brains going tick, 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 trying to figure out how to respond to it, because that was the last thing they thought that I think he would do was, go out and dare to talk to the mainstream media. Why would you bother with that?
Well, and there was just the wave of tweets that were inevitable or not even tweets, but there were some stories about 2 months ago, they were, poking fun at candidates who do things like CNN saying CNN's dead, right. CNN has no influence, CNN, no Republican primary voters speak to CNN. And then, 2 months later, they
watch our important interview with Jake Tapper.
Right. The LFG sort of mentality after, months of, poo-pooing on the influence of the mainstream media was evident,
So, Matt, the reason I wanted you on the show also, not just because we could exchange DeSantis gossip all day, you have a new book coming out. Tell us about it. And it is a subject near and dear to both of our hearts, the great state of Florida and its politics.
It is. It's called Swamp Monsters, and it'll be out in January. We're just putting the final touches on it. And it's kind of interesting, the evolution. That was originally my idea was how Florida is kind of the biggest swing state in the country to, very functionally center right now. But as the DeSantis-Trump relationship sort of became the, most defining relationship in modern Republican politics, or maybe politics more broadly, the book sort of reflects that now. And it sort of charts the evolution of that relationship. It's not always been as good as it seemed, even in the beginning. There's always been behind the scene tension, and we got some color and some anecdotes that haven't been told about that. And we also chart, the rise of DeSantis winning by 20 points, Trump winning the state by 3 points, which was seen as a lot in 2016, sort of is mirrored, but followed the trajectory of the drop off of Democrats in the state. It's essentially a one party state at this point. So we talk about both paths, the relationship Trump and DeSantis and its impact nationally. It's got a national focus, and then how the collapse and the national Democrats giving up on Florida has, really helped expedite that.
Yeah, it's a point. It's a point that I think you made. You and I've talked about this a bunch. That the question of DeSantis winning by 19 points wasn't how did he win by 19 points. It's why didn't he win by more? I mean, the Democratic Party mounted a candidate who both sides hate. I mean, the Democrats don't trust Charlie Crist, and the Republicans hate him with the fire of a billion suns because he's a former Republican. DeSantis outspent him by, I don't know, something like a 20-1 or something.
Sure.
And it's like, he inherited this enormous operation, the best Republican Party in the country, all that. I mean, and that is really a question. I had Nikki Fried on a couple of weeks ago. We had a great conversation. I love her, but it is a party. The Democratic Party is a party that has a very high hill to climb in this state.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the most interesting data point, I think, of that, going back to 2018, the last midterm election here, the national Democratic groups put in about $60 million into Florida. This cycle, that number was 2. So they functionally gave up on the state. I mean, the past party chair, Manny Diaz, he ran with the idea that Mike Bloomberg was going to fund the party. They were close. He said, elect me and I'll get Bloomberg money. That never happened. And the party never really got off the mat. The anecdote that, I think exemplifies that in a real way. I didn't know who the Florida Democratic Party's communications director was the entire cycle. They just functionally didn't exist. So it was, a party that didn't exist, and Nikki's trying to rebuild it now, but it is a steep hill to climb. And I don't think they're to the point where in 2024, things like, winning U.S. Senate races necessarily should be the barometer. But I think they're trying to build in smaller metrics to sort of build the idea that they are making progress. And we'll see how that goes.
So, Matt, when you started writing Swamp Monsters, you did have that conception it was going to be about this Trump-DeSantis race. When you started looking at it, did it feel like DeSantis would be further along today against Trump than he is? Because he seems... I mean, he started out in polls about a year ago. There were surveys I saw about a year ago where it was, Trump 50, DeSantis 35. And now Trump's in the mid 50s and DeSantis is in the mid to high teens.
Yeah, I mean, I thought Trump was always the front runner. I was under no conception that anything but right. I didn't. And I think some other people had better foresight than me, because I think some people did call this, but I saw it as being a slightly closer race with Trump as a front runner, but DeSantis definitely in the mix. And when it started to hit for me, there's I forget the exact name, but there's a big Western in Denver, a big Western annual conservative convention where everyone goes, and there's this massive off-year straw poll. And DeSantis won it 2 years in a row. And I remember talking to the folks out there, and they were kind of like, we expected Trump to, maybe do a little better. And DeSantis won this thing 2 years in a row. And everyone out there, I talked to a bunch of conservatives and Republicans, and this is during, last year or so, a while ago. And they were all, sort of touting how big of a presence he had there. And that's when the light went on for me, saying, all right, we're covering a national politician. This is no longer just a governor. And it seemed like all arrows were pointing up. What is notable to me is how quickly the collapse kind of happened. Because after I spent election night in 2022 in St. Petersburg covering Charlie Crist's election night, quote, party, which kind of felt like a funeral for yeah. Well, it actually felt more like a funeral for a political party, honestly. But on my drive back from Tallahassee, I spent the whole time listening to conservative radio. So this is the day after the election, and everyone from the Buck Sextons of the world to all of the major national conservative talking heads, all they could talk about, especially since Republicans didn't do as well nationally, the entire focus was on the great new hope that is Ron DeSantis. And so that was November. So it's not as though this was a long period of time from DeSantis going for America's governor for conservatives to down 30 in national public polling. It really has been sort of a quick process, which I think is kind of, a notable element of it, and just, speaks to how much the base is still sort of hardwired for Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, and I also think there's a weird contradiction with Ron DeSantis. And I don't know if you've observed this as well. I'm sure you have. He fears Trump at a certain sort of like basal level. And I always find that ironic that this is the guy who talks the toughest in a way, never back down of all these people. And yet he's just as cautious about offending the dear leader as the rest of them.
Yeah, and internally they're open about it. We've seen memos that have leaked intentionally. Otherwise, I sometimes those happen accidentally, sometimes they don't. But in there, they openly say they're never really going to train their fire on Trump. The line that was in some of the stuff we've seen was, if they're asked about it, they'll address it, but then the question asked, question answered, and they're going to move on to Biden. So, and even in one of the memos we reported on a couple of weeks ago, they talked about Tim Scott, not Donald Trump. So Tim Scott is making gains in the polls. Tim Scott's making gains in the polls. Tim Scott is closing the gap from 2 to 3, and they're focused on the guy that's on their heels as opposed to the guy they're losing to by 20 or 30, which I think is an interesting observation unto itself. They're not even sort of sprinkling the internal communications with how do we address the Trump problem. It's how do we address the everyone else problem, which is I think a snapshot of the thinking to what you described.
A loose, and I would call him a disaffected DeSantis ally in Tallahassee this weekend said to me, he goes, how do I keep going back, a lobbyist, how do I keep going back to my clients and telling them to give more money to Ron DeSantis when he's basically now starting to see Vivek Ramaswamy outperforming him, a guy who has spent no money, who is nobody. How do I explain that to our corporate people that and folks, if you don't know this, folks, every lobbyist in Tallahassee, Florida, the third largest state in the country, it is a multi-billion-dollar industry. They are being told by the DeSantis team in and out of government, you better perform for us, you better raise money for us, you better deliver, or there will be consequences. And so this guy was like, Tim Scott's one thing, but how is he losing? How is he losing ground or holding ground while Vivek Ramaswamy is climbing up? How is that possible? And it really is a weird sort of the only easy day is yesterday, the Navy SEAL kind of thing of it pays to be a winner. And when you're not a winner, when you're not perceived as the guy who's the inevitable winner, things start to get loose around the edges and fall apart.
I do think the answer for those contract lobbyists who are having those conversations now is if their clients have any business in Tallahassee, no matter what happens, Ron DeSantis is going to be governor for the next 2 years, for 2 more years. So if I'm one of those contract guys and I have to bring that to if they have any business in Tallahassee, then if anyone thinks that they're not going to keep score in that regard, they're mistaken.
His government people have been so blunt about, like, you better perform for the governor. You better call the campaign. You better call the super PAC. I mean, that's the kind of shit. Like, I got to wonder. And one person said to me recently, he goes, I'm going to do what I've got to do, But I also wonder if like I'm going to have to talk to the FBI at some point when they come calling because this is so blunt and over the top in a lot of cases. They're not really the most like delicate, sophisticated players.
Well, it's the putting it in writing that I think caught a lot of people by surprise. I mean, being a governor is inherently a political job, and the idea that staffers for governors have, perhaps made phone calls in the past from the Florida, Republican Party of Florida building has probably happened. But there was text messages out to folks, sort of actively trying to bundle contributions
during work hours.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what. Because initially when those messages were going out, like the same night, I was getting them flagged to me like, what is this? And, if you do something that grosses out a contract lobbyist, then you've done something that's, definitely not.
Right. These are not people with, shall we say, the most delicate moral sensibilities.
Right. Yeah. I wasn't getting texts from kindergarten teachers,
Right. So as you were writing Swamp Monsters, your point that Florida has taken this fairly abrupt turn to the right. It was you could say the arc of politics was bending to the right in the state of Florida for a long time. But when in the era of Trump and with this MAGA migration to Florida, it seems like we're moving further and further, faster and faster.
Yeah, well, I mean, Florida's been purple nationally for a long time, and that's why it's on the map. But it's performed red for a long time. I mean, it's the Democrats haven't had a modicum of power here since the mid '90s, and Jeb Bush and some of the education stuff is really while the modern Republican Party really much dislikes Jeb Bush to a large extent, he really was kind of on the front end of a lot of the slow evolution you talked about. But right now, it really did happen fast. I mean, Republicans have super majorities in both chambers of the legislature here, and Ron DeSantis has the legislature on a fairly short leash. So from a policy perspective, one thing it can't be kind of overstated, he got everything he wanted in the runway up to his presidential launch. I mean, all of the policies, all of the things that he wanted the legislature to turn into law so he could then campaign and raise money off of, they did almost 100% of it. So he had sort of the perfect runway to launch for president, which makes it is kind of another data point that you can look at and say, well, this is really not going, as it should have or as planned, because not only did he have the most money, he had years of hype, but he also had a legislature that was, really wanted to see a guy from Florida run for president, and they did everything they could do to help him. And it's just none of it is stuck once Trump really started to engage again.
How much buyer's remorse do you think there was in the legislature? Because I know there were people who were in the legislative, in both houses, particularly the Senate, that were very nervous about 6-week abortion ban, a lot of the woke stuff. How much buyer's remorse do you think there is right now among those folks?
I don't totally know how to answer that because I don't think there wasn't really a choice necessarily. I mean, this is for lawmakers. I mean, for lawmakers who Ron DeSantis is the first governor in a long time that overtly will find someone to primary you in an election. And when Ron DeSantis, we found in the midterms, when Ron DeSantis picks a candidate in a Republican primary, essentially the person who was in there, even if they were, the anointed one by leadership, they drop out. You just can't beat that. Ron DeSantis is still at the state level. The Morning Consult governor's poll just came out. He's still very popular here. He's above water by 8 or 10 points.
Sure.
So the idea, I guess you could say, well, if you really didn't want to take this vote, you could fall on your grenade, you could stick with your principles, and you could probably be in the legislature for 2 or 4 years and go home. So I don't know that a lot of these guys really saw a choice. And to some degree, I guess that's political cowardice, right? Like if you're taking votes you don't want to take just to sort of save your own hide, that's an argument to be made. But I don't know that having a political career in Florida, a Republican political career in Florida, and voting against Ron DeSantis are two things that can coexist.
Ron DeSantis will be governor for 2 more years. We'll see if it's a hard landing or a soft landing out of this campaign. We've got a lot of people looking at replacing Ron DeSantis in the next couple of years, including Matt Gaetz, Wilton Simpson, the ag commissioner, Blaise Ngolia, a whole bunch of other ones, including even Don Jr. talking about it to people that I've heard. Where do you see that race coming? I mean, it strikes me that the first real post-Trump, like MAGA primary will be that race.
Yeah, I mean, well, and I think unless there's some drastic change with the base, I find it hard that a traditional politician, a Wilton Simpson, who is now the agriculture commissioner here, a former Senate president, who's very much a traditional sort of politician. I'm just find it hard on a debate stage with a more sort of MAGA type personality, a Byron Donalds or a Don Jr., like you mentioned. I find it hard unless there's some drastic shift in the party, which I don't foresee. It feels like the MAGA types or the, I guess the Governor DeSantis wing of this party, as opposed to a more Chamber of Commerce wing of the party, is going to carry the day, or at least have to be viewed as sort of the favorite going into that sort of race. And it's going to be a crowded primary, so who knows? But it feels like the edge has to be to the sort of more carnival barker type politician, as opposed to the one that's focus grouped, and the one who can go viral versus the one who can be restrained and try to just get one line in a debate, as may have been typical in the past. Yeah,
it's going to be a big messy field. Well, Matt Dixon, you are a deeply knowledgeable guy on the great state of Florida. I've loved having you on the show. Hope to have you back again soon. The book is Swamp Monsters. Pre-order it now. It is going to absolutely tear a lot of things open for you about how Florida works and about the internal war between Trump and DeSantis. I look forward to having you back again on the show, Matt. Tell people where they can find you on social media.
I am on Twitter or X. I'm still getting stumbled there at mdixon55, and that's my main social media channel. That's where most of my content goes, and where I'll be talking about Florida coverage and the book. Okay.
Manny Diaz is Florida's education commissioner right now. And it is under Manny that he has gleefully accepted the mantle of Ron DeSantis's desire to burn higher education and K-12 education to the ground in Florida and remake it in the vision of Moms for Liberty and this ahistorical group of people who they believe have taught must push back against woke history teaching. Well, this week, and Manny, I love you, brother, but this is too far, and you know it. This week, they released a curriculum that, while it had a number of things that weren't controversial, it had something in it that has become a huge national news story, and that story is that slavery benefited many of the people by teaching them valuable skills. No, also no. This idea is so ludicrous on its face and so trollish and hostile and demeaning and terrible that any human being with a scintilla of moral fiber would have looked at it and said, "The hell is this?" Absolutely not. The idea that you try to ameliorate the history of slavery in the state of Florida or in the country is abhorrent. It's repulsive. It is the great national sin of our character. It is the thing that has never been fully healed. It is something, as we're bending the arc of history in the right direction, it's something that acknowledging the horrors of slavery is vital to do. But this curriculum that they released, this idea that they defended, that there were good things about slavery, Manny, brother, you are on the enemy's list, and I hope you'll find a way to find in your heart the decency and courage to say you won't be a part of this anymore. Until then, you're on the enemy's list. Thanks again for listening to The Enemies List. If you have any comments, questions, or if there's someone you'd like to hear on the podcast, hit me up on Twitter at @TheRickWilson. Thanks again for the wonderful support you've shown the pod. We're growing fast. It really helps if you will share this with your friends, your family, and anyone else who, like us, is trying to save democracy. While you're at it, if you could rate and review the podcast, I would be very much appreciative. I know this is the sort of thing you've heard a billion times. Please rate, review, like, blah, blah, blah. But you need to do it. It really does help us a lot. We are slaves to the algorithm, my friends, and if you do this, it will help get the pod out further. Anyway, thanks again for listening. I'll see you next time. And remember, whatever you do, stay off the list.